essentially my story is I always wanted to write, but it took me a long time to get there because I had to, I guess, hone my craft, but also build confidence. And I think for me, and I don't want to say this is true for everyone, I needed a bit more life experience before I could write a story that felt good to me. So as somebody at university, I didn't feel able to tell a story that felt meaningful and strong and full of pathos. Whereas by the time I'd left and lived a little bit, I felt that I was in a better position to write that. And again, just me, not everyone, but it worked best for me that way.
What is up, everybody? You're listening to episode 128 of SFF Addicts. I'm your host, Adrian M. Gibson, and welcome to your weekly dive into the world of science fiction, fantasy, and writing craft. Joining me again is my illustrious co-host. She was at the last two episodes, but the Chewie to my Han Solo, the Joker to my Commander Shepard, MJ Kuhn. She's back. How you doing, MJ?
Can't get rid of me that easy. I'm doing good. How are you? Yeah.
Jeez. Your job is doing my work for me. I'm doing well, though. Thank you.
Yes.
And if you want to support MJ so she doesn't have to work a day job anymore, you can pick up her debut novel, Among Thieves, this beautiful heist book right here, and its sequel, Thick as Thieves. If you want to enjoy a complete duology full of heists and found family and hatchets and all kind of mischievousness, just like Thorin and MJ's background.
Yeah, if you want mischievousness, you can check out the background of the YouTube. If you want mushrooms, you can check out Adrian's debut, Mushroom Blues. Mischievous Mushrooms. Ooh, that's a tongue twister. But yeah, which I just saw. As of recording, you crossed 1,300 copies sold, which is dope as shit. So check it out. Join the party, everybody.
Join the party and get high.
Get high on Adrian's supply.
We condone that here in SFF Addicts, apparently. And now welcoming today's guest back to the show after, I think, a couple years, the wonderful Tasha Suri, author of the Books of Ambha duology and the Burning Kingdoms trilogy, which starts off with this beautiful baby right here, Jasmine Throne. And the newest sequel, the third book in the trilogy, The Lotus Empire, is out now. How are you, Tasha?
I'm really good. I could just listen to you two talk all day, though, quite honestly. You've got such good rapport. It's great. But no, I'm really happy to be here. It's so nice to be back.
Well, thank you. We're very happy to have you here. We're glad that you enjoy our mischievous rapport and
our banter.
Our banter, witty banter. I'm very excited to chat with you again, though. This is our first time being able to do a bit of a deep dive and to do a masterclass with you. But for now, we're going to start off with an introduction, just to give listeners and viewers a better sense of you as a person. If you want to tell us a bit about yourself and your work.
Yes, of course. So I mostly write epic fantasy. I have written young adult fiction, so I wrote a historical based on Wuthering Heights. Ask me about Wuthering Heights. I can talk about it for many, many, many hours. And I've also written a novella for Doctor Who, which I really loved because I love Doctor Who. But the work I'm best known for, as you said, is the Books of Ambha duology and the Burning Kingdoms trilogy, both of which are inspired by South Asian history and culture. The Books of Ambha is, I guess you could call it romantasy, though that term didn't exist when it was published.
That wasn't a hot thing at the time, but it is definitely
right. You were ahead of the curve.
I was. I wish I'd been on the curve. The curve is where I wish I'd landed the book, but never mind. It's let's say romantic fantasy about a young woman with magical powers who discovers that her marginalized people's magic is used to keep the empire in power, essentially. And also there's an arranged marriage, so it's all good fun, apart from all the depressing stuff that happens. The Burning Kingdoms I often describe as morally grey lesbians working together to burn down an empire, but I think a fairer description might be a princess wants to take an empire and another one, a priestess, wants creepy plant magic, broadly, I think is fair. But they also want each other, so there's something for everyone. In my normal life, I was an academic librarian for many years, but now I am mostly a full-time writer. I'm also a writing coach for a company called The Novelry, so I get to do a little bit of that teaching stuff that I used to enjoy. I have 2 cats. I have 2 rabbits. They're all boys. They're all destructive. I love them very much. I don't think their gender makes them destructive. It's just because they're cats.
I have
and
two sons, and it kind of does. So
my cat is also a boy and destructive. Yeah. I'm just saying we have a pattern.
I'm a boy and I'm destructive. I have to say
that my little girl cat never destroyed anything. She was so good. So
just a little angel cat. All right. Yeah. Anecdotally, there's a pattern.
Yeah, anecdotally. We're not being gender essentialists. We're just pointing out a pattern. So yeah, I have lots of animals. I have a lovely family. Mostly animals, so they take up so much time.
I love it in the very best way.
I'm from a family of 4 boys, and definitely it is chaos incarnate. So
yeah, if I had 4 sons, I think it would be worse. The 4 animals is okay.
Yeah,
right. 4 fur sons is okay.
Yeah,
not 4 human sons.
Not 4 human sons. You're vastly outnumbered at that point. I love it. We like to unravel the nerdy origins of all of our guests on the show. So let's dive back into Tasha Suri's history and childhood. Are there any particular books, movies, games, shows, anything like that that you remember from those formative years that really hooked you into sci-fi fantasy?
Yeah, definitely. Oh God, it's hard to think of specific things, but I think anime had a huge impact on me. I only loved it for a brief period of my life. So probably from when I was about, let's say 10, 11, until I hit university, at which point I met other people who actually like it, but by which point I didn't. Brilliant. Went really well.
Oh no. Great timing.
I know, wonderful. But I remember watching things like Sailor Moon, Dragon Ball Z I was obsessed with. Don't ask me why. The Vision of Escaflowne, I think is how you say it. All of those kind of things really, really appealed to me. I loved that they had, high stakes, human relationships, boys with wings, body horror, those kind of things really worked for me. I also loved Princess Mononoke had a massive influence on me. I watched that film over and over again. And I think if you look at my work, you can see its influences very strongly around,
especially like the nature magic in the Burning Kingdom.
Yeah, I was just thinking that I hadn't picked up on that, but now I can see it.
Yeah, the body horror, the body horror in the Burning Kingdoms, the nature magic, my soft boys. I always have a soft boy in every book. Yeah, and that's completely Ashitaka's fault. Is there a murderous girl with a knife? It's all Miyazaki's fault. So
at least one.
Maybe we can have 3 or 4 just for flavor. But a hot older woman who makes bad decisions. You have everything in his work. But those were the things that really had an impact on me, I would say, particularly.
I love your highlights from soft boys and girls with knives.
No, look, there are people
hot old ladies.
Look, there are people who look at fiction and they look at it and they analyze it very analytically, and they can tell you, the influences, the symbology, the way that, different schools of thought influence the work. I thought that was cool, or that was hot, and that's what influenced me. I can talk about theory if you want me to, but it's not really my inspiration in any way, shape, or form.
I love it. It's like the spectrum. We'll call it like the boys with wings and the body horror spectrum. It's like
yes.
Cool to hot. Tasha's spectrum right there.
I mean, they're both essentially body horror, aren't they? Right? Like having wings is kind of body horror.
That's true.
In a weird way.
Yeah. Especially in anime.
But apparently, it's these days it's super hot. These days, everyone loves boys with wings and
yes, they do, right? Like in The Court of Thorns and Roses and stuff, right?
Like Bat Boys. It's a whole vibe apparently. So
once again, Tasha's ahead of the curve. So
right.
Come on, people. Fucking romantasy.
I'm pretty sure that Sarah J. Maas got there before me. I think there is a possibility she did.
We won't give her that one. We'll just assume it was you. Fuck it. Okay, so going from anime and all this amazing influence, how did writing start? How did that kind of like grow alongside your love for stories, both like visual and textual?
So, I did read books as well, probably should say. I was always a big reader as a kid. I read a lot of things, kind of the classics, Enid Blyton, Roald Dahl, those kind of British children's stories that people read around the world. Whenever I visited family in India, my cousin had the entire Sweet Valley High books, so I would read all of those. I read all the way till one of the characters, I can't remember who, got divorced or her husband died in a motorbike. No. It doesn't matter. Died in a strange freak accident. That series went on way after high school. But I loved reading and I loved stories. And I remember very young, I would say things to my mom like, I want to be an astronaut. And she'd go, that's lovely, dear. Or, occasionally I would say things like, I want to learn to play the harmonium. And she actually got me harmonium lessons. It's an Indian instrument. And I was awful at it. I don't know why she thought that was a good idea. But one of the things I kind of spewed out was I would love to write. So she bought me these notebooks to write in. And I remember valuing them more than anything I owned, because I was like, this is like an adult grown-up thing to write in a notebook. I don't know why I believed that. So I would write stories in those notebooks. And I remember I must have been very young when this began, because I didn't know how to use capitalization and I didn't know about full stops. Because when I learned about full stops, I was very angry that no one had told me, because I thought my stories were now bad. I don't know who was judging these stories apart from me, but I was not happy about that. So
you were writing like a Virginia Woolf style stream of consciousness.
Yeah, apparently I did. I think they were not very good. There was one which was something along the lines of, there was a girl who was an orphan because her family died, and then she went into the sky and fought a dwarf. I don't know. It was something, in my head thought this was a great idea. But I definitely enjoyed writing from a really young age. And I always wanted to be a writer. And I'm almost a little bit ashamed of admitting that, because I didn't become a writer until my late 20s. That was when I got published. So it wasn't as if I moved. If you have the revelation when you're too young to use full stops, you don't get that to your late 20s. You feel like you've been a little bit slow, right? But I kept writing. I went to university and did English and creative writing, which somewhat killed my love for writing for a short time. Then took a bit of a break, got another real job. I worked in the National Health Service for a while. I was in medical admin, essentially, which I actually really enjoyed. And then went into being a librarian, first in hospitals and then in a university, and kept writing the whole time. But I was very slow. Wasn't sure I was doing a very good job, frankly. But I just kept going. And then I don't know if this was the point of what I was meant to be saying, but then I eventually did a Twitter pitch competition, I think, and got some interest, and then sent off a query with a sample to some of the people who were interested, and I got a full request, at which point I realized I had to finish the book. So the classic terrible
pitch contest before it was done. Oh no.
It's so stressful. The only person who's done this, but I think, and I remember finishing it in a panic and sending it off, and I didn't get a response to that one, which is good because it probably wasn't very good at the time. So I ended up, I'd written a draft of a book before. This was the one that went through the pitch, but I edited it, tried to fix it up, sent it off again, and then it was out of my hands for a while. And eventually I got so I remember I won't belabor this, I don't want to make people feel sad, but my father passed away, so I stopped caring about how my querying was going. I remember getting some more full requests, sending them off, not thinking anything of it. And then when I got back from India after his funeral rites had been finished, I was in my house and I remember getting an email with an offer of representation. So it was very bittersweet, but it was lovely to get that offer and to move towards publication. And I would say that essentially my story is I always wanted to write, but it took me a long time to get there because I had to, I guess, hone my craft, but also build confidence. And I think for me, and I don't want to say this is true for everyone, I needed a bit more life experience before I could write a story that felt good to me. So as somebody at university, I didn't feel able to tell a story that felt meaningful and strong and full of pathos. Whereas by the time I'd left and lived a little bit, I felt that I was in a better position to write that. And again, just me, not everyone, but it worked best for me that way.
No, I totally feel that. And also, I studied English literature, and so it's I totally feel you when you're academic, that whole academic scenario and studying lit and creative writing and that kind of stuff. It's yeah, it kind of does kill your buzz quite a bit. It's it is really good as a learning experience. And I think from a craft level and a structural level, understanding that stuff is helpful. But man, is it's such a buzzkill for your creativity to be I'm just submerged in this stuff all the time, and I have to write an essay for it that's going to get graded and blah blah blah. That stuff does,
it
does kill the buzz.
I think it opens your eyes to what's going on in the world of literature, but it also values certain literature over others. And if anything, doing an English degree, and this is probably why I can't go back and do a master's ever, is it made it clear to me that, we may value certain kinds of literature and analyze them more heavily than others, but that isn't necessarily a sensible approach. I think that, for example, I read when I was at university, I wrote an essay about romance fiction. And compared it to Margaret Atwood, because I would use any excuse to try and talk about things that interested me more than what I was studying. And I love Margaret Atwood, but I thought romance fiction.
I lucked out because Margaret Atwood was actually an alum at my university. She was she
oh my
was
god! Did you get to meet her?
No, I didn't get to meet her personally, but I saw an alumni lecture that she gave to the creative writing department there.
Oh wow, that must have been amazing.
So cool. Yeah,
I wish I got to do that. I ended up, as part of that research, reading an article by Danielle Steele, and it talked about a bunch of girls who had read Danielle Steele and used her work to kind of inspire their own reading. And I thought, we don't talk enough about how like popular contemporary fiction impacts people, how it makes them feel, how it interacts with what we believe in the real world, right? I think. And that's a shame, because I think that's more interesting than necessarily looking at some books that no longer have the same kind of resonance or relevance. Like, again, it's not a book, but it's still relevant. I always find it fascinating to watch old Star Trek, because you can see how political attitudes and things that scared or concerned people changed, reflected in Star Trek. I mean, look at Deep Space Nine and the way that it talks about terrorism, colonialism, surviving, being conquered, what happens to a country after that ends, and the way that, early Star Trek talks about things that are clearly references to the Cold War is really fascinating to me. Sorry, I always have to get a Star Trek reference into every conversation.
I love it. We have to meet our Star Trek reference quota. No, that is interesting, though, because I often kick myself for not majoring in creative writing in English.
Really?
What
did you major in?
I studied
it helps.
Communication and marketing, which is what I work in for my day job.
And hey, you made the right decision.
Yeah.
Well, that's what I'm like. Yeah. Oh, okay. Maybe I would have, because I couldn't.
But also think about how much
of
being an author these days comes down to communications and marketing. So
yeah,
no, for sure, sure, there is helpful stuff.
And
but
I don't know if
anyways.
Oh, sorry. Go on.
No, go ahead. I was like, I felt like I just took us off track there.
No. I think it's interesting. Like, I also think that when I studied creative writing academically, I don't think it taught me anything about publishing. When I came into publishing, I was green. I knew nothing about how the industry worked at all. So a lot of it was a shock. A lot of it I had to learn just by being in there. And I wish that, and I think if an academic course gave you more grounding in what to expect from the industry, I think that would be helpful, but that was not my experience at all. And I don't know if, Adrian, you had the same kind of experience there.
It was all craft and like nothing to do with what creative writing means as a job, which I think is such a failing of pretty much most creative writing education, where it's like, yeah, you can do the thing, but regardless if you go trad published or self-published or hybrid, so much of it involves learning skills that are more applicable to like a business degree or, being an entrepreneur.
Yeah.
Well, it's like, you can do the thing, but okay, how are you going to make a living doing the thing now?
Right. Right.
How are you going to manage your finances and all that stuff?
Like, oh God, don't. Finances. I have to say, like, the one thing I really focus on now that I do coach is thinking about the market. And I'm like, it's not selling out to think about the market. You don't have to write things you hate, but dear God, don't write things you hate. But you do have to read what's going on, what's getting published now, and think about why you like it, why other people like it, so that you can sit yourself in conversation with those things. You can't just write in a bubble where you're not engaging with what's going on around you, because that doesn't do you any favors, and it takes away, it may allow you to do craft, but it doesn't allow you to do craft that will get you where you want to go, certainly.
Yeah. And in your case, it's like your first published books were the Books of Ambha. And I'm just from listening to like all your influences and stuff like that, and how you kind of, set the stage for the romantasy boom. I'm gonna give more credit to you.
Well, please, if people catch that, if I say that I set up the romantasy boom, can you imagine? Yeah. And they'll be coming from
then I'll just be like, come to Adrian M. Gibson. He's the one who spouted that shit. But
hey, all press is good press, okay?
But it's very clear that like you wrote those books for the love of those types of stories. It's like the stuff that you were probably reading in your English and creative writing courses were not necessarily the stories that you felt connected to, especially as like someone with South Asian heritage, Indian heritage, living in the UK, and like the UK literature monolith of like Shakespeare and the big like the romantic poets and Chaucer and all these different kinds of people. But for you, like, how did you start thinking about the Books of Ambha and in terms of like something that you put your love and sort of like reader desires into? And then did you know it was going to be a duology, or was that something that kind of came about from the publishing side of things?
That was partly publishing, and I will touch on that a little bit more. And if I forget, please do remind me. But I the good thing is that I've always loved things like Shakespeare. Chaucer, less so. Don't tell him. Don't think he'll. But I loved things like the Fairy Queen, Gawain and the Green Knight. I loved Shakespeare. I loved, the Romantic poets. All of those things did influence me. And I loved sort of more contemporary writers like 20th century. I loved a good Victorian novel. Those things meander in a way that really quite pleases me. So all of that did work for me. And I would say that like I write within that Western tradition because I write in English, I write in the UK. But at the same time, some of the storytelling that was very important to me were things like the religio epics that I grew up with via my grandmother. She really loved those, so I knew about them. My dad had worked in Bollywood when he was younger, so he had a really big love for the films. So I grew up watching things like Pakiza, Mughal-e-Azam, and Mughal-e-Azam is inspired by the Mughal era, funnily enough. So that had a big influence on me. And a number of other kind of films like Jodha Akbar, which is so peak romantic, fully recommend to anybody who wants a good romance movie to watch. And I wanted to bring those influences into my work. I think, especially when I was at university, the conversation has moved on massively since then because now I feel very old. But there was a big discussion about, how do we have fantastical worlds that are not white? And there weren't really very well-known, well-established writers of color writing that kind of work. There had always been those writers. Again, we can turn to Star Trek for evidence of that. But they hadn't necessarily had the same kind of survival in the market, so that I, as somebody who didn't have the kind of access we do today on the internet to information about loads of books, didn't know about them. So I knew about N.K. Jemisin, and that was kind of the limit of what I had. But then I also read authors along the way as I started thinking about non-Western fantasy and about having people of color in fiction, like Nalini Singh, who has written so many paranormal romances. And by large, she has written mostly people of color in her books. So she writes extremely diverse casts of characters, and she is not marketed in that sense, but nonetheless, that is true and integral to her work. I really admired what she did. And Marjorie Liu, before she wrote Monstrous, had a paranormal romance series, the Durkensteel series, which was honestly so weird in the best way. Like there was a whole book where there was a were-shifter and a pandemic in Africa. I don't know what she was doing with that book. There was one with like reincarnation and Chinese dragons. She just had a really good time. So all of those things had an influence on my sensibilities about wanting to have kind of non-Western influences in my work, wanting to bring elements of my diaspora experience or the stories I'd grown up with into my work. So I wrote the Books of Ambha for me, first and foremost. I wrote the world for me. And it was the kind of book that I would always wanted but never had. And I think that reflects because you can see that I've drawn on the Mughal era, which is one that I find really interesting. The Mughal dynasty I find really fascinating. So I researched them and drew on them heavily. But I also drew on the romance of people like Marjorie Liu and Nalini Singh. And that was important to me to include. But at the same time, it's in many ways a very typical kind of coming of age fantasy, right? Reflecting things like Leigh Bardugo or the kind of the romances you see in Juliet Marillier's Seven Waters trilogy, which really affected me as well. So it's very diaspora in the sense it's a mash of the Western and the non-Western in the way that I could best access it.
Yeah.
Does that make sense?
Totally. And when you wrote, so you wrote both books before they were published?
No, I wrote the first book, and then it's coming back to the series or not. So when so if I remember correctly, it was a few years ago now, when I sold Empire of Sand, my editor said, in an ideal world, we can make this a series. And I thought, fantastic, because actually the kind of the books that I'd most really engaged with and read were authors who wrote long series with lots of different romances. So they would have a romance per book. So in my head, I had about 4 books in my head that could be in the Books of Ambha. And I wrote and we sold it as a 2-book contract. So I wrote the first one and then I wrote the second. And at that point, my editor left. So I was orphaned. I know. Sarah Guan, who till recently worked at Erewhon, she was fantastic. And then I moved to Priyanka Krishnan, who was also fantastic, but I'm now with Tiana Coven, who is also fantastic. So it's all been really good. But she left, and then in the midst of her leaving, so there was a bit of crossover, I wrote a proposal for a new book. So for anybody who doesn't know, and I know you both do, when you want to sell more books to a publisher, or sometimes when you go to lots of publishers, but not always, you will write a proposal where you include, depending on what they want, a few chapters, a synopsis of the ideal entire plot, because things change, and why they should buy it. So I put that together, and I remember starting to come up with the idea, and there was a particular character in the realm of Ash who I can't remember the name of now. It was so many years ago. And I was like, I will use her as the main character for book 3 before I move on to book 4. And I started putting the story together, and I went, I feel like she and this other girl need to be in a relationship. And I remember contacting my agent and going, would Orbit buy a queer romance from me, or do they want straight romances? And she went, don't be absurd. She said it much more nicely than this. Of course they'd buy a queer romance. And at the time, I was out to my family. I was, married, so they knew. But to the larger family, let's say, and to the public, which is a weird thing to say, but I guess as an author, you have an audience. I wasn't out. And there were a lot of reasons for that I'm not necessarily going to go into, but you can imagine culturally it was a little bit complicated. And at that point, I thought, I think I want to write this honestly, and I would like to include a sapphic romance, something I enjoy just as much as writing a straight romance, frankly. So Orbit were very happy. They had no questions about the queer romance at all, none at all. But they did say, this feels like a very different book. This feels like the start of something bigger. The ending ended on a kind of cliffhanger. It felt like a lot was going on. It was much more political. And they said, would you consider revising this as the start of a trilogy, as an epic fantasy? And I thought, I don't know if I can write epic fantasy. I don't know if that's something I'm capable of, which feels absurd now, but was pretty much how I felt at the time. And then I remember my agent said, do you feel like you can do it? And I said, let me think about it. So I went away and I thought, the story as it is now is a Books of Ambha story, but it isn't, but it would need to be something else if I was going to make it stand alone. It would need to feel different. It would need to reflect all the things I haven't done in the Books of Ambha that I've always wanted to do. So if I'm going to do it, I'm going to do it. I'm going to take some risks, and I'm going to write exactly the kind of story I want, which meant bringing in multiple points of view, lots and lots of points of view, a much greater diversity in faiths and cultures, and much more complexity. The Books of Ambha focus very narrowly on specific parts of the empire that they explore, whereas I would say the Burning Kingdoms is much broader in a lot of ways. I was like, I want to have a lot more peril. I want to have a lot more death. I want to have a lot more moral grayness. I want to explicitly engage with some kind of religious practices and historical events that are rather upsetting or uncomfortable, like sati, the ritualistic burning of women. I want to engage with depictions of important mythical figures or religious figures and how they were depicted, I guess. These kind of old women from these stories. So if I'm going to do it, I'm going to do it. So I rewrote everything for the proposal, the first chapters, the story, the plot, everything. The plan for the future books, which I did not stick to in any way, shape or form, but nonetheless. And I sent that in, and Orbit wanted it, and they took it as the Burning Kingdom. So it became, essentially its existence cut off the Books of Ambha, because I couldn't write one, I needed to write the entire Burning Kingdoms, but I also couldn't write the next books in the Books of Ambha without writing book 3 to reach book 4. So there is a kind of running joke among my friends that Daddy Warlord can never exist, which was my working title for book 4.
Oh no, you got Daddy Warlord got blocked.
Daddy Warlord's a great title.
That's so fascinating, though.
I love the development of how these two series interconnected.
It's such a radical pivot, right? From a cat. Sorry, anyone that's watching on video. There's a cat on screen.
So if I looked very alarmed a second ago, he just launched himself onto my desk, almost knocking over everything, but somehow didn't. So I'm quite pleased about that.
Next time he'll get all of the cups and everything knocked over.
He's going to keep doing this. Don't worry. If I can remove him, if that's helpful.
It's all good.
Oh, absolutely not. Yeah. But okay, let's talk a little bit more about the Burning Kingdoms trilogy and kind of dive into it. It sounds like the seeds of the story kind of came to be planting or sprouting out of that first series of yours, the Books of Ambha. But let's talk a little bit more about the kind of historical influences in the Burning Kingdoms. You've mentioned them a little bit in what we were just speaking of, but what are some of the kind of advantages of drawing upon history? What are the challenges? Ooh, my camera.
Your camera's like alive today.
Yeah, it keeps moving with your face.
I know, it's a brand new one. I just got it on. It was a Prime deal. I was sending Daddy Bezos back to space. One purchase at a time.
Can we call him Daddy Warlord now?
Anyways,
no, Daddy Warlord is copyrighted to me. Okay. No one else can have Daddy Warlord.
He can't have it. I'm so sorry. This has gotten so chaotic. But let's talk about the historical influences behind the Burning Kingdoms and the challenges and advantages that come along with using kind of history as an inspiration or a base for fantasy world.
Mm-hmm. I think sometimes so I feel like I should move away from the Mughal Empire, but I can't help myself. I love them so much.
No, but if you have an obsession, it's like just dive into it.
It's one day I need to go back to all my history books because I've got this pile that I read with great focus, but now things are starting to fade and I'm like, I need to go back in. But I really drew heavily in the Books of Ambha on the Mughal era and the kind of the Mughal dynasty. But in the Jasmine Throne and the entire Burning Kingdoms, I wanted to go broader. So I tried to use a lot more a greater diversity of influences on the world building. So there are some elements of things like the Sikh Empire and things from Punjab in there. There are elements of kind of just random things that I picked up along the way, I think is a fair way of putting it. I think the way that I've often described it is I tried to do a bit of a mashup in the same way that you find a lot of fantasy and kind of COD medieval eras mashes things together. If we look at, for example, George R. R. Martin, Game of Thrones is not about, like, let's say Renaissance Italy or even, medieval England or whatever it might be. He draws on lots of different influences to shape his world. And that is very accepted, complex and interesting world building outside of a non-Western perspective, whereas non-Western fantasy is often asked to be Chinese, Indian, whatever it might be. So I went more broadly, let's say South Asian in this case, to try and build the world. But there is a central conflict in the books around a family and who gets to inherit. And that was very inspired by a particular spat, let's say, between some brothers in the Mughal Empire. Because the way inheritance worked, you wouldn't necessarily have the older son inherit. Often it ended up being that all the sons would have a bit of a Barney with the dad until one of them won, and most of them would die along the way.
That sounds messy as fuck.
Oh, yeah. I mean, look at the Ottoman Empire did the same thing. The Ottomans did it too, and it was bad. Made some really good soap operas, though. Yeah. If you ever see Magnificent Century, great. Any of the kind of the harem soap operas about like the wives of the Ottomans, fantastic. Totally recommend them. But that's an aside. I'm the reason for the chaos, MJ. I'm sorry.
I support it. I'm here for it.
So the Mughals had a kind of a messy inheritance system, let's say, and I remember finding one particular woman within these messy inheritance systems really interesting. So Jahanara Begum, and she was the sister of two would-be emperors, let's say, and she was burned very young in an accident. So she was wearing silks basically covered in oil, perfume, and caught fire, and she was badly burned. But she was, which is one of the things that was well known about her. But she was also a great politician, and she would kind of negotiate between her brothers, and she managed to survive this particular battle for the throne while siding with the wrong brother, because she was just that good, which I found fascinating. And I kind of wanted to draw a little bit on that spat. I should stop calling it a spat. This war for the throne.
I like it. It's a war. It's just,
because I think in this case, we'll use spat. We don't want to call it like a Game of Thrones or a War of Thrones or anything.
No, that might lean too close to something else. Yeah. But I thought that would be a really interesting influence. I think the benefit of that is that history is so full of drama and so messy that you always have something to work with, right? There are so many things in history that are nigh on unbelievable. Towers of heads is one, fights between brothers that are so intense that, they cause dramatic incidences that could only work in a soap opera. The worst things you've ever seen in, Game of Thrones happened in real life, apart from anything involving a dragon, I think it's fair to say. Even then, who knows? And so I think, and also when you read historical texts, the way people describe events, there is often a magical kind of element at play because of the way that propaganda and people's perspectives on events works around their beliefs, their faith, the way they view the world. I remember reading about the this particular Hindu sect that the historians wrote had magical wicked powers. Now, did they? No, probably not. But it was the perspective around faith and positioning the demonic versus the holy, right? It's that kind of stuff in the propaganda, and would happen vice versa. So my rambling point is history is a goldmine for world building and for writing stories. It has everything. The downside of drawing on history, of course, is that it can be a bit of a cage if you stick too closely to real history, right? You can kind of end up drawn into one direction. So I was very keen to kind of avoid that by writing the story that I wanted to write and just using the history as influences. So if you, for example, say this is an early modern fantasy set in a fantasy Renaissance Italy, you are kind of... early modern and Renaissance, they're not the same thing. Never mind. Let's say a fantasy Renaissance Italy. You're kind of limited by what that means to an audience. And the other thing that you have is kind of the Tiffany problem, right? That people have a perspective on what history looked like and what happened and how things were done that isn't always true to historical fact. So people may believe that in those days they had no medicine, for example, and they may have had very advanced medicine, but we just don't perceive that in the modern day, in the kind of popular cultural perception of a time. So as a kind of aside, when I was writing the Wuthering Heights remix, the young adult one, I did a lot of research and found a lot of information about, immigrant and diaspora communities in the UK. If you watch a TV show set in the early 18th century, you won't see those communities because that isn't our perception of that time. And when you look at adaptations of Wuthering Heights, you won't often see, apart from one exception, a non-white Heathcliff, because our perception of Heathcliff is so at odds with the textual perception of him, where he is explicitly a person of colour. Had to get that rant in. So I think with fantasy, the best thing you can do is draw on history without letting history control you. So you can say, this is broadly this, but we are not writing about specifically this. We're drawing on influences and having a good time.
Yeah, it's like finding that right balance between historical realism and accuracy versus fantastical imaginings, and the fact that these books are entertainment first and foremost, right? It's
they're not a textbook.
Yeah.
Sometimes people say and I don't mind it, but sometimes people say I learned so much about India from your books, and I'm like, you didn't though, because you've read a fantasy. This is sorry if you just heard the doorbell, but this is an entertaining fantasy. It is not a historical text that will teach you about India. There are plenty of those that you can read, but my work isn't one of them.
Yeah, that was kind of my approach for Mushroom Blues, where I'm like, this book will teach you some things about mushrooms, some of which are true and some of which are fabrications or sort of twists of reality.
Extrapolations.
Yeah. Extrapolations, exactly. I like that.
Yeah, mycological extrapolations. But the point isn't necessarily to teach, it's to
words.
pique someone's curiosity enough that they go and seek out the real information. So it's like,
Right.
if
Yeah.
you're fascinated by the history that you infuse into your books, hopefully that is what sets someone off to be like, okay, I'm going to go down like a Wikipedia rabbit hole tonight after finishing this book or after finishing this chapter. And that's kind of the hope, not necessarily like, I'm going to teach you all you want to know about the Mughal Empire with the Books of Ambha. It's like, no, I'm going to send you off in a direction that will hopefully like a self-guided course on whatever particular thing about the Books of Ambha piqued your curiosity. And I think that's kind of the magic of SFF.
Like 100%. Yeah, absolutely. And I think sometimes there is a desire for work, particularly work of authors of color, I would say, to be teaching tools, like to educate people. And I'm like, there are plenty of books that can educate you. A book isn't meant to teach, well, I guess it can teach you something, but it's meant to make you feel something. It's meant to make you think and ask questions. It's not necessarily meant to give you answers. So, I didn't write The Jasmine Throne, for example, wanting to say, would it be better for a woman to rule than a man? That isn't the point, Is empire good? How do we rebel against empire? These aren't questions I'm answering. I'm just saying these particular really messy people approach this problem in this really messy way. Enjoy yourself or don't. That's what reviews are for. But if it piques your interest, there are so many wonderful nonfiction texts you can engage with, and go forth and do, or just have a great time and then move on.
Yeah. Speaking of messy characters,
I want to talk about the messy people. Yes. I know. Look at that. I was like, ooh, I wanted to talk about characters. We've spent too much time together, Adrian. But yeah, let's talk a little bit about the characters. I want to specifically talk about Malini and Priya in the Burning Kingdoms. How did you create them? It sounds like they may have existed before the plot of the Burning Kingdoms, based on what you mentioned about the inspirations behind
the Sapphic
where
origins.
the story came from in general. Yeah. But like, where did they come from? And then how did you move to kind of fleshing out this really well-rounded surrounding cast with all these different POVs that you have?
So I think I've remembered the name correctly. This is awful because it's my own book, but there was a character in the Realm of Ash called Jahan, and she was the inspiration for Malini, but I don't think Malini is actually very much like her at all. So that's where she began, and then of course it became the start of a new series, and then I started to think about the characters. And Malini, I wanted to write the kind of female character that I really love, which is to say the very high femme woman who is very aware of how to use her beauty and her femininity to her own ends, but often gets positioned in a lot of fiction, right? As somebody who is all about men, wants a man, wants to get this husband that she can utilize. It's sort of a Cersei Lannister figure, I would say, in a lot of ways, though I loved Cersei. I thought she was fantastic. But I think there's a kind of approach to that particular character archetype that I wanted to play with a little bit. So I thought about some of the women in Hindu mythology and in Hindu religion, like Draupadi from the Mahabharata, who is the wife of the Bandhavs, so she has many husbands, and is essentially shamed before the entire court, and then says she will not tie up her hair again until she bathes in the blood of the person who did this to her, essentially. And I thought there was something about feminine vengeance and femininity that I kind of wanted to pick at a little bit. So she was sort of inspired by those women in mythology, in religion, that I wanted to explore. And I also really do love the idea of a woman who is, clearly a lesbian, not interested in men in any way, shape, or form, but is also aware of how she can utilize her beauty to manipulate. Is it even her beauty? Her femininity, her performance of femininity in order to manipulate the men around her. And there isn't necessarily any sexual element to that. It's about playing with the power she possesses in the position she has. Whereas Priya, I named Priya, funnily enough, because Priya is the name of so many girls I know. It's a really, really common Indian name. It just means like beloved or pretty, right? So I was like, it's a name where she would go unnoticed. It's a lovely name, but it's not a name that would draw any attention to her. She's just a normal woman except that she's not. By dint of her social position and her position as a colonized person, she is, she doesn't have to perform femininity in the same way. It wouldn't benefit her to do it, nor is she interested in doing so. She has a secret that she's hiding, obviously, because she has this magic that she's not meant to have. But she's essentially so much more at ease in her own self. And her performance is about hiding who she really is rather than performing something for other people. So I really wanted that contrast of position and contrast of performance of self that I thought would be really interesting. And also, when I come up with a character, and this might sound really odd, and I don't know if you can relate to this, I always think about how they feel in their body and how they hold themselves. So I was a monumentally awkward teenager, so I was always very aware of my body. I was always like, oh, I'm taking up too much space. Don't look at me. And obviously everybody looks at you more when you do that. But I always think of Malini as this, very straight back, very tall, very, comfortable, like very aware of herself woman, whereas, Priya kind of slouches because she's just more of a soft butch. It's just in how she holds herself completely.
I also think like they nailed that on the cover.
Yeah, they really did. I actually,
on the cover.
She really does. Like, I remember when we worked on that cover, it was me and Priyanka Krishnan talked about it before it went to the art department. Lauren Panapinto is fantastic. And Micah Epstein, who drew the art. But we talked about how cool it would be to have a woman in a sari on the front cover. And we talked about what Priya was like, what she looks like, how she holds herself, and tried to get that across in the cover. So that was really lovely. But I guess the point is that there were aspects of them before I even started the book, but a lot of what happened is they grew together in my mind. They, whenever you write a romance, right, they have to kind of bring out something in each other that is unexpected in some way. So I think the fact they're both hiding something in terms of like not necessarily their sexuality even, but just their ambition or their power or their hunger, and then they see it in each other was really fascinating to me, and that kind of allowed me to build them as characters.
And at the same time, you're able to use, because you said from the outset you wanted to write, I mean, funny enough that this book is about ambition because you were very ambitious with what you wanted to do with this trilogy, but the fact that you wanted actively to write a multi-POV cast, to have lots of POV characters, and you do have lots of POV characters in all 3 books. And I think those different perspectives allow you to kind of view some of the very big themes that you have in the book, whether it's ambition or prophecy or religion, war, but also things like magic and all of the different things that drive the external and internal conflicts of each character. By having those multiple POVs, you're able to have these very nuanced perspectives on like how someone feels versus how they are perceived, and the ways in which their actions are driven on an internal level, but how they're viewed on an external level is really, really cool.
Oh, thank you so much. I think I really loved having lots of point of views to work with. I enjoyed kind of bringing in the red shirt perspectives, characters who definitely weren't going to survive past the chapter they were in. But I really enjoyed that. I liked sort of looking at these people who don't consider themselves, who either were just getting on with their day and things went horribly wrong, or were, culpable in certain regimes but didn't think they were doing anything wrong, and how that impacted them in, as events took place, essentially. But I really enjoyed particularly bringing in some specific perspectives that I maybe wouldn't have if I hadn't felt comfortable bringing in lots of point of views. So Ashok was really exciting for me to write. That's Priya's sort of like adoptive, essentially, brother. He was an important character to me. I'm very fond of him. Bhumika, of course, Rao, like all of those characters who are not Malini and Priya and therefore aren't like part of that central romance, but was still so important to me and to the journey of the trilogy and of the themes of the trilogy, were really fun to write and to explore on page. And sometimes they surprised me as well, which was nice.
I love it when characters surprise you, because then it means like, okay, the character surprised me as the author. Therefore, the reader is probably going to be like just as surprised or even more so by what happened.
Right, blindsided.
Oh, I don't know. Sometimes I think the reader's a bit of ahead of the author. Sometimes they see what you can't quite see on page. I remember, I think it was in book 1. I'd written most of book 1, and my editor was like, well, obviously Rao is gay. And I was like, is he? And she's like, honey. And she was correct. I was like, yes, he's just, it made me go, oh yeah, all along he is quite clearly the one who has not come to terms with his sexuality, and not in the kind of self-hating way I think a lot of people perceive being in the closet is like, but often what being in the closet is like in a homophobic society is not acknowledging it even to yourself. So, and I think that was an aspect very strong of his character, and all these men he kept falling in love with, all of them are repressed, but it's fine. So that was kind of fun to realize and explore a little further.
Some sad boy.
Oh my gosh.
He's such a sad boy.
Such a sad boy. We always need a sad boy.
He's a token sad boy.
Oh my god.
Oh my gosh. Well, for winding down for part 1 of our chat, how are you feeling about bringing the Burning Kingdoms trilogy to a close? You've spent a long time with these characters and with this story. Are you feeling happy with what you've been able to achieve across these 3 books? Are you super sad to be leaving all these friends on the page? How does it feel to wrap up this series?
Oh, it's so weird, right? Because I think my biggest fear writing the 3rd book was that I wouldn't do it justice, because not just for me as the person who wrote the series, but for the readers. I thought if people have invested the time into the first 2 books, I want the last book to be good, but then you become, and I'm so sure you're familiar with this, you become torn between wanting to please them, but also doing right by the story you planned all along. And in the end, I thought I have to write the story I care about and planned all along, because that's the ending I've always known is going to happen. Like, I knew the ending from when I started. I had such a clear image in my head, and I knew that that's the image we end with Malini and Priya. So I have to do that. And I did do that. And I remember writing the ending and just being in tears because I was like, it's over. It's over. There's an element of relief because I've been with these characters so long that I'm like, I'm ready to write something new. And I have, of course. But I also felt a real kind of joy and completion. It's as if I'd carried them on this journey and raised them to this point, and now I've done it. I've done what I planned to do with them, and I can let them go. And now they belong. I think I wrote in the acknowledgements at the end, I think I said they belong to the readers now. So I hope that people, and you don't know, do you? But I hope people enjoy the story and feel fulfilled by it and feel it did everything that they wanted from it, or at least feel that, it wasn't too sad. And we'll find out.
Babies are all grown up.
Right? Yeah. All grown up and out of the nest. Oh my gosh. Well, you said you're working on something new. Can we be nosy? What have you been working on since?
Yeah, so wrapping? Have you noticed, I don't know if you've noticed that everyone's writing books about knights at the moment. Have you noticed that?
Oh, I haven't, but now I'm gonna, now that you've put,
MJ's like, I'm gonna write a book.
There are oh my god, there are so many, and I'm going to start naming some, but I'm going to miss some out. So, The Knight and the Moth by Rachel Gillick. Alex Harrow has a Knight book coming out. Lady Knight books are like 6 deaths. Was it 6 or 7 deaths of the Saint? I'm dyscalculic, so let's pretend I got the number correct.
So many deaths.
So many deaths of the Saint. Inspired book. I can't remember her pen name, so I'm going to have to pretend that I don't know the name of the author and move on. But The Second Death of Locke is coming out from Orbit next year, and that's Knights as well. There is a Lady Knight book coming out. There is a book by Caitlin Starling. There are about 6 of them, basically.
Wow,
and I am part of that. So
I love it. Yes.
Which on some level, I thought I would be more nervous if there were only 2 of us. I think the fact that it's like knights is kind of hilarious to me on some level.
Yeah, well, there's always something in the water, right? Like, I feel like those trends just kind of, it's not like the authors get together and plan it. Like, it's just something in the ether.
I feel like it's like, that meme of that guy with like all the threads connecting? Yeah. It's like that, but it's just a picture of Dev Patel's face leading to all of these books. That's what I think happens.
Fair, though.
Yeah,
fair. Right?
But yeah, it's a book about a knight and a witch who keep reincarnating and falling in love and killing each other, and they have to keep doing this, or the isle they live on, which is like a alternate Britain, will fall. And unfortunately, in this lifetime, there is somebody killing people like them, incarnates. So they have to try and stop this person and hopefully stop their own eventual falling in love and death. Will they succeed? Who knows?
That sounds fucking awesome. I am all in.
That's the book. I'm very excited for it.
Yeah,
You
that
had me at
sounds fascinating. I
reincarnation.
love
I'm
that.
all in on this.
I love a good
Yeah.
reincarnation story, and it's kind of a mix of Arthurian legends and reincarnation and a bit of the Fairy
Yeah.
Queen. So I've had a great time,
Fantastic.
basically.
Well, next year is the year of the night, apparently.
Year of the night.
So-
Year of the night.
Right? 2025,
Bring
baby.
it. All right. Well, Tasha, closing out, I have a two-parter for you. If you could give listeners and viewers a good bit of soundbite writing advice, and B, a weird or random fact that you find to be utterly fascinating.
A little soundbite of writing advice. Write something you would really enjoy reading. Imagine the book that you've never got to read that you would love to pick up in a bookshop. Write that book because no one else is going to do it for you. Horrible cough. Let me think. A random fact that I find really interesting. It's not so much a fact, it is a fact, but I'm really fascinated by that one whale that makes like whale noises at a pitch that no other
At a
whale can
different
hear, and it's all alone.
frequency. Yes.
Yeah. I think about that whale a lot.
I do too. Like, honestly, weekly. I'm
Yes,
like the loneliest
same.
whale
I'm like, I
that
wonder
ever
if
lived.
that whale's still around or if it's found any friends, and I'm always like, I wonder how that whale is doing. It just
He's like
haunts
the
me.
lonesome George of Wales.
Yes.
Maybe he's an
Aw.
introverted whale, and maybe he's happy with how
I
that
hope
Just
so,
singing-
because if
he's
he's an
like
extrovert, he's
singing
having
to
a bad
himself.
time.
It's like him humming in
Yeah,
the shower.
he's just
you know?
vibing.
Except the shower's the
Yeah.
ocean.
The giant
Let's
sea
go
shower.
with that
Yeah.
interpretation. Makes me feel better.
This extremely confident and happy lone whale is humming to himself in the shower known as the ocean.
In the
ocean
ocean shower.
Absolutely.
Yeah,
Only
what a happy
whales,
whale.
yeah.
Happy whales. Well, we're happy whales because we got a chance to chat with you, Tasha, and I'm very, very thankful that you sat down with us, and I just had a great time. My face is hurting a little bit from laughing.
No,
and
thank
smiling,
you
so-
for having me. Like, sorry, I didn't mean to talk over you, but I've had such a good time, and thank you for letting me be chaotic. It's been
Just a
wonderful.
bunch of chaos whales. Tasha, can you please let everyone know where they can find you online?
You can find me mostly on Instagram as Tasha Suri, TikTok as Tasha Suri, and probably somewhere else. Oh, I have a website. There's that too. So feel free to find me at any of those locations.
And go and pick up Tasha's books. You got the Burning Kingdoms trilogy, which is complete. As of, I think, either when this episode comes out or next week, the third book, The Lotus Empire, is out.
Awesome.
You can go check out the Books of Ambha duology. If you want some Wuthering Heights remixology or some Doctor Who, Tasha's got you covered there too.
Remixology.
That's from my that's from my music journalist days.
There you go.
Oh, I love that.
Then Tasha's got you covered. These are chonky books, so you get your money's worth. Don't you worry about that. Yeah.
Oh, heck yeah.
And you can also follow SFF Addicts on Instagram, Threads, all that jazz at sffaddictspod. You can follow me at Adrian M. Gibson. If you want some fungal noir, you can go pick up Mushroom Blues. And MJ, what about you?
Yeah, you can find me across all the main socials at MJ Kuhn Books, or go to my website, mjkuhn.com. Sign up for my newsletter. I just revamped my newsletter. So I'm actually sending stuff, and it's I'm sending cool stuff. I'm interviewing authors and sending stuff, and I'm sending memes and fun shit. So yeah, sign up for it, and you also get a free novelette. So mjkuhn.com. Do that.
And support the Thorin Food Fund because that little fur baby's hungry. Yeah.
Oh yeah, also buy my
MJ's
books. I always forget to say
That's
that.
why I'm here. So support MJ so she can quit her day job and then make Thorin a little bit fatter than he
Right?
is.
As he deserves. As he deserves.
Yes.
He
Yeah.
deserves to be so much chonkier, right? I'm trying.
He does.
Oh my God. Well, that's it for this episode. Stay tuned next week for part 2 with Tasha, where we're going to dig into a masterclass on fictional family dynamics. For now, keep reading, keep imagining, and we'll see you next time on SFF Addicts.